Hello again, Quarantographers. Happy Friday. Happy almost my birthday. Tomorrow's my birthday. I will be turning 32, and I will be doing it on lockdown. Hooray! I had a few members of the Quarantography community request some tips for group posing. Now, groups are extremely difficult. I've done my share of them, but I would not consider myself the undisputed champion of them. That title goes to photographer Art Streiber, and Leibovitz also very good at that. But that said, I do have some tips that I think will help you generally improve your group posing. Not that any of us are getting anywhere near a group these days. So I'm going to walk you through a few of my group photos that I've taken. One's a more corporate group shot, one's kind of a press shot, and then there are two more creative personal work group shots. But before we start, just a few general tips about group shots. First of all, groups are wide, naturally. They're much wider than the aspect ratio of your camera. So one of the most common ways to narrow that up so they're not taking up this crazy narrow strip in your frame is to stack them. In very large groups, you've probably seen baseball teams on risers, or maybe even just shots where the photographer is super high up and that kind of naturally stacks people. These are great techniques, they work, they can be a little generic, and if you have the time and resources, I strongly suggest you try getting a little creative with that. And what that means generally is you want to find levels. You want to get everyone's head on a different level from each other. And this works from groups of 2 onwards. If you have 2 people, maybe have one of them standing and one of them sitting. If you have 3 people, maybe one is standing, one is leaning against a desk, and one is sitting on a chair. So yeah, staggering levels is a really great way to add a little bit of dynamism. Another one is once you get into larger groups, try and clump them up. Don't have them super evenly spaced across the frame. Try and clump them into groups. If you're doing a large corporate group, try and maybe splitting them up into their divisions. Anything to add kind of a thematic division that helps kind of break up the monotony of the group. So that can be super helpful. If it's really wide and you don't have space, you're probably gonna end up having to use a wide angle lens. Be careful about that. When you have people towards the edges of a frame, you're gonna find that people get distorted. So really use the narrowest lens you can physically. It's not always easy. And in portraiture in general, it's always important to think about how you're interacting with your subjects. Groups are no exception here, except since you can't possibly individually pose every person, usually, more about that later, you have to give your people some autonomy. So you have to kind of work with them as a director. You have to make sure they know who their character is. If they're actors, that's easier. But you have to make sure they're present and they're interacting with you and not just waiting for you to tell them what to do. I find a great way to break that tension and kind of bring people back into themselves is to have everyone check in with each other. If you even just say that, check in with each other, take a look, say hi, you'll often get a nice laugh out of people, and then you can call them back and they'll kind of be a little bit more in themselves. They'll have shifted their weight into a more natural position. So that's one little trick. And then one other quick technical thing, try and make sure you can see everyone's face. Really pay attention to this. I like to let my subjects know that if they can't see my lens, I can't see them, and that usually gets people 90% of the way. After that, you just need to keep an eye out for people whose maybe like jaw is behind somebody's head. They won't be able to tell that necessarily. Finally, be careful about your lighting. If you are using a more dramatic or off-axis light, people's heads will cast shadows onto other people's heads, and you don't want that. So if it's a really large group, you may want to consider a more centered lighting source, or at the very least, a very, very soft wash. So let's go to some examples here. First off, this is a group of entrepreneurs at the accelerator called UrbanX. These guys are in the process of creating very cool startups to solve the problems of urban life. And I only had like 5 or 10 minutes with these people. So thankfully I had a little bit of time to set up beforehand, but it wasn't necessarily the easiest space. I had a really big window on the left and I knew I wanted to use that, but I knew the people on the right would be falling into shadow. So I actually set up a giant softbox, the largest I could find, at the camera's point of view and turned it camera right, so it was, as you would say, pushing the light towards that side. It kind of just continues what the window is already doing and just kind of brightens it in a generic way off to the rest of the image. That's how you get an even exposure for an image this size. Note that I've clumped people. This is a group of 6 or 7 startups, so you can kind of see like this is a group that's one startup, this is some of the leadership, here's some other groups. You know, it's tough with this many people. I can't say I necessarily nailed it on that front, but the clumping I think helped. Levels, once again, we had to pull out whatever levels we could find. We had this low one here, we had some people standing on it there, regular standing here. You can see they're standing on a bench there, down here. anything that you can add levels to, and preferably to my taste. I don't necessarily like it when they're all on just 2 exact levels. If you can find ways to have at least 3 or 4 different levels, I find that adds just a little bit of dynamism to the image. Things I'd change about this in retrospect: this was shot with a pretty wide angle lens, and you can see once again this guy on the left is getting a little bit stretched, on the right a tad. It's not the worst. I wish I had the time to pull these people in the center forward and make it less of like this bowing effect. But overall, I think it's a fairly solid image given the constraints. Moving on, this was a press photo for the cast of The Handmaid's Tale right before season 1. I was very excited to be able to shoot it, but up front they told me I had 5 minutes with them, and that was very scary. However, I did have an hour and a half ahead of time to pre-pose, so that was important to me. I got there early. I worked with an assistant and had her sit in all the positions possible to kind of just get a sense for what it might look like. Anybody in the area I could enlist to sit in for me, I did, just to kind of test out clumps, and actually that kind of helped in the end, figuring out these little clumps. We had a couple here, we had a high-low clump here, we have the star in the front, we have a triplet. Anything I could do to just add levels was key to the effectiveness of this image, I think. Note that I did have a fairly off-axis light. There were definitely a few frames I took in which one person's head was in the shadow of another's. I think she fell into shadow from her a couple of times. You really don't want to find out later that you messed that one up. The cast arrived late, and the PR person was very insistent that we wrap things up quickly, so I unfortunately didn't even really have the 5 minutes I was given, so keep that in mind. And thankfully they humored me when I asked them to try 1 or 2 where they were embodying their character a little bit. Here's another cast photo. This one ended up being used for promotion of the web series. This is Brian Jordan Alvarez in the center, and his web series, The Gay and Wondrous Life of Caleb Gallo. A really fabulous series, and we worked for a while on the posing of this one. Thankfully we had like a day in the studio with them for this. Once again, I've placed the star in the center. Thankfully everybody involved was very down to play around and flex their characters' muscles a little bit, as it were. But once again, look, we have clumps. A duo here, a trio here, a solo here. It helps when you're taking a group shot to think of it as several smaller shots sometimes. And this allowed me to kind of focus on, playing with Brian as a solo and then playing with this group as a trio, and having each group kind of be their own autonomous unit. It's a lot easier to manage a group of 3 than a group of 6. So think about it that way. Once again, I had to be pretty specific about head placement to avoid shadows. And then finally, here's a group I recently shot. Very proud of these shots. This is a podcast I love called Rude Tales of Magic. It's a Dungeons & Dragons podcast, and the group was fabulous to work with. It helped in this case to have a theme. The concept in this shot being The Last Supper, but with D&D. Prop styling was key here, making sure everybody had something to do. Once again, these subjects were very game to play around, and I had a lot of time with them, which was very helpful. They were almost a little too game to play around. What happened was every shot, everyone was trying something new. And what happened was there were some shots where one person was doing something absolutely stellar and a couple of the others were maybe even blinking. And that's exactly what happened in this shot. So, hidden tip, if you're going a little bit further than just smiles, get ready to do some compositing. I'll show you the PSD on this one. Here it is in the final edit. Here was the shot out of camera. I actually composited 4 different photos for this one. After, before, worked out in the end. So take a lot of photos if you can. If you have the time, just make sure you have plenty of fodder, and being on a tripod really helps too. Here the theme was a little bit more on the film noir side. This actually wasn't composited, but once again, just take a look. We have levels, we have clumps, we have a group of 3 here. I'd almost call these 3 ones. But the point is, I worked for a long time individually with each of these people to kind of make sure they had a story and a reason to be in the situation they were in. And that just adds a certain amount of verisimilitude. You almost are kind of like a film director in these situations, except you have to condense an entire story into one frame. Now, as things get bigger, things get more complex. And I did mention Art Streiber, who is a very storied photographer, and he has become kind of the go-to guy for like unbelievably complex group shots. I've pulled a few of his images here. This was straight off of his website. Note the odd aspect ratio. That's one way to do it. in order to make this work, he's definitely shooting, medium format, or he'll sometimes shoot vertically with a full frame camera and then literally stitch the images together. There's a lot of compositing in his work because he's just aware that if you really want the best image, the best frame for each person is going to be in a different frame, just from a likelihood standpoint. To wit, I took a workshop with Art, and he was really very open, as he usually is. Check his Instagram, I actually strongly recommend it. It's at AS Pictures. He's very open about what goes into his images, and it's a tremendous resource. But this photo contains an unbelievable array of some of the most important and talented and famous people in show business. And the amount of production that went into this was astounding. I mean, to say nothing of things like craft services or just to find a studio large enough to have this set. The most striking thing that I learned about this shot was that ahead of time, due to the fact that these people are all busy and are not likely to be able to stay for very long, he actually had an artist sit down and sketch this image ahead of time. So he literally pre-posed everybody. Before coming in, they knew exactly which step they were going to be standing on, what position they were going to be in, and that allowed this to happen. He still took a bunch of frames. I may be wrong on this, but I think this is one of the few shots of his where he actually managed to get everybody in the same image. Very frequently he'll have to take the image several days apart based on the schedules of people involved. So you better bet compositing is involved here, even though these people were all available at the same time. This is definitely a situation where you're going to want to use some sort of trick to get high resolution on this, either by compositing a bunch of images together or with medium format or something like that. So yeah, those are my tips about group posing. Think about it. I know you're probably not gonna have a chance to do it right now, but if you're feeling ambitious, you could always do a group shot with yourself. Never hurts to have perspective of both the shooter and the subject. If you learned something, please consider joining the Quarantography community on Patreon. We have a lovely, lively Discord where we discuss techniques and lighting and all of the above. Until next time, stay safe, stay sane, stay inside, stay shooting. Thank you very much.